The brass compass landed on the scarred wooden table with a sound that rang like a bell in the quiet room, and Vance Yardley looked up from his logbook to see the orc woman standing in his doorway with rain already darkening the shoulders of her wool coat. "Found it in a chest I was clearing out," she said, her voice steady despite the wind howling behind her. "Thought you should have it back." He knew her face before she spoke. Hessa Farrow had visited twice before over the years, always brief stops on her way to somewhere else, always with some small token or story about his brother. The first time had been 3 years after the wreck, when the wound was still raw. She had brought Thomas's watch. The second, 2 years later, a leather-bound journal that had somehow stayed dry in a sealed tin. Both times she had stayed perhaps an hour, accepted tea, spoken carefully around the edges of grief, and then sailed away with the tide. "You did not have to come all this way," Vance said, rising from his chair. The lighthouse keeper's cottage was small, one main room with a kitchen corner and a sleeping alcove, built into the rocky headland where wind and salt spray had scoured everything to essential shapes. He had lived here alone for 6 years now, tending the light, watching the sea. Hessa stepped inside and closed the door against the weather. She was not what most humans expected when they pictured an orc. Slender and graceful, she moved with a dancer's economy, her green skin marked here and there with the pale lines of old scars. Her hair was black shot through with silver, pulled back in a practical braid. Small tusks curved up from her lower jaw, barely extending past her upper lip. She wore sailor's clothes, canvas trousers, and a heavy knit sweater beneath the coat, and her boots were worn smooth from deck work. "It was on my route," she said. "I am sailing north to Krellmark. Crew job on a merchant hauler. Leaves in 3 days, so I thought," she gestured at the compass. "Better now than never." Vance picked up the compass, feeling its familiar weight. The brass was tarnished, the glass face cracked across one corner, but the needle still swung true north when he turned it. His brother's initials were scratched into the back casing, crude letters carved with a knife point. Thomas had carried this compass since their father died, had trusted it more than any chart. "Thank you," Vance said, and meant it, though the words felt inadequate. "Truly." Hessa nodded once, sharp and final. "I cleaned out the last of my old ship storage today. That was the last thing I had that belonged to any of them." She paused, and something moved behind her eyes, some current of old pain. Thought it was time to stop carrying ghosts. The wind hit the cottage wall like a fist, rattling the window shutters. Vance glanced toward the door, then at the darkening sky beyond the salt-streaked glass. "You should not travel in this weather. Storm is worsening." "I have sailed through worse," Hessa said, but even as she spoke, a fresh gust howled across the headland, bringing with it the smell of deep ocean and coming rain. The temperature had dropped throughout the afternoon, and the clouds had piled up along the horizon in bruised masses. Vance set the compass down carefully on the shelf above his desk, next to the watch and journal. "Stay until it passes. I have tea, bread, and fish stew." She looked at him, weighing something. In the years since Thomas drowned, Vance had become good at reading the small hesitations in people, the way they calculated whether engaging with a grieving man was worth the emotional cost. But Hessa's hesitation was different. She was deciding whether she could afford to stay, whether the weight of shared memory would drag her under. "Just until the storm clears," she said finally. He put the kettle on and ladled stew into bowls while the wind continued to build outside. They ate without speaking much, the silence comfortable in the way it can be between people who have both learned to live with loss. Hessa sat at the table with her back to the wall, a sailor's habit, her eyes occasionally flicking to the window where the last daylight was fading into gray murk. "How long have you kept the light?" she asked eventually. 6 years this autumn. After Thomas died, I could not stay in the village. Too many people wanting to talk about it, or worse, wanting to avoid talking about it. Vance drank his tea, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. The lighthouse service was hiring. I knew the coast, seemed appropriate, solitary work. That was the appeal. Hessa smiled slightly, an expression that pulled at the corner of her mouth and made her tusks more pronounced. I understand that impulse. Outside, the rain began in earnest, a driving sheet that hammered against the roof and turned the world beyond the windows into gray static. The lighthouse beam would need to be lit soon, before full dark. Vance had maintained the light through storms worse than this one, had climbed the iron spiral stairs through howling gales to ensure the great lamp kept turning, kept warning ships away from the rocks that had claimed too many vessels over the years. "I need to light the beacon," he said, rising and pulling on his oil coat. "You are welcome to the fire. I will return shortly." The lighthouse tower stood 30 yards from the cottage, connected by a covered walkway that did little to keep out the wind and spray. Vance made the journey without thought, his body knowing every step even in the dark. The tower stairs spiraled up through 5 levels of storage and equipment rooms before reaching the lamp chamber at the top, where the great Fresnel lens waited to be lit. He worked methodically, trimming the wick, filling the reservoir with whale oil, adjusting the clockwork mechanism that would rotate the lens through the night. When he struck the match and touched it to the wick, the flame caught and swelled, and the lens magnified it into a beam that swept across the water in steady intervals, a bright finger pointing out safe passage through the dark. From up here, he could see the ocean spreading out in all directions, white-capped and violent beneath the storm. Somewhere out there, Thomas had drowned. The merchant ship they had both crewed on had broken up on the Sorrow Reef, 20 miles south, and of the 15 souls aboard, only 6 had survived. Vance had clung to a piece of decking for 8 hours before a fishing boat found him. Thomas had gone under in the first minutes, dragged down by a piece of rigging when the main mast snapped and fell. Vance had searched for him afterward, swimming through debris and screaming his name until his voice gave out and his limbs went numb with cold. But the sea had kept his brother. He checked the lamp a final time, then descended the stairs back to the cottage. Hessa had cleaned their bowls and was standing at the window, watching the storm. She turned when he entered, rainwater streaming from his coat. "Rough night to be at sea," she said. "Yes." He hung the coat to dry and moved to the fire, holding his hands out to the warmth. "You made the right choice to stay. How many ships have you seen wreck on these rocks? 3 in 6 years. I got the light burning in time to turn away dozens more. That is the work. Not the rescues, but the warnings heeded." Hessa nodded slowly. She understood, he thought. She had been at sea long enough to know that most heroism was the quiet kind, the disaster that never happened because someone did their job well. They sat by the fire as the storm raged outside, and eventually Vance found himself asking the question he had never quite dared before. What was he like? On the ship, I mean. I knew him as a brother, but not as a sailor. Hessa was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. He was good at his work, steady hands, clear head, the kind of man you wanted beside you in a crisis. She paused. He talked about you often, worried that you had stayed behind in the village while he went to sea. He was the one who wanted to sail. I was content with fishing boats and coastal work. He knew that, still felt guilty about it, I think, felt like he was abandoning you. Hessa's voice was soft, careful. The night before the storm, we were on watch together. He told me that if anything happened to him, someone should check on you. Make sure you were all right. Vance felt something tighten in his chest. You have done that. 3 visits in 6 years. You have honored his request. Have I? Hessa looked at him directly. Because from where I sit, you do not look all right. You look like a man who has buried himself in work to avoid thinking about what he lost. The words stung because they were true. Vance stood and moved to the window, though there was nothing to see but his own reflection in the rain-streaked glass. I am alive. I am functional. That is more than Thomas got. That is guilt talking. You think I do not know that? He turned back to face her, and for the first time in years he felt the anger rising, the old burning resentment at the universe's unfairness. I was right there. I saw the mast fall. I could have warned him, could have pushed him out of the way, could have done something other than just survive while he drowned. Hessa stood as well, meeting his eyes. You think you are the only one who feels that way. I was on watch. I was supposed to see the reef, supposed to call out in time for us to turn. I missed it. I was the reason the ship broke apart. The storm was bad, yes, but we should have had time. I should have seen the warning signs. Instead, I was distracted, tired, and I missed the shift in the water that would have told me we were too close to the rocks. Her voice was fierce now, all the careful controls stripped away. 15 people on that ship. 9 died. I have carried that for 8 years. The silence that followed was heavy with shared pain. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the headland, but inside the cottage the air felt still, waiting. I am sorry, Vance said finally. I did not know you blamed yourself. Why do you think I kept coming back? Hessa asked. Bringing you his things, checking on you. It was not just about honoring Thomas's request. It was about trying to make amends for failing him. You did not fail him. It was a storm, an accident. These things happen at sea. Then why do you blame yourself for not saving him? The question landed like a blow. Vance had no answer that would not make him a hypocrite. He returned to his chair and sat heavily, feeling the exhaustion of 6 years of self-recrimination settle over him like a blanket. Hessa sat as well across from him, her posture less rigid now. We are both fools, she said quietly, carrying guilt that does not belong to us. Knowing that does not make it easier to put down. No, it does not. She looked at the fire, watching the flames dance. That is why I am leaving. Going north, starting fresh somewhere that does not remind me of that night. Maybe if I am far enough away, I can stop seeing the water close over their heads every time I sleep. Vance understood the impulse. He had done the same thing, in his own way, retreating to this remote lighthouse where the world narrowed to wind and waves, and the simple task of keeping a light burning. But he had learned something in his isolation, something he suspected Hessa had not yet discovered. Distance does not heal it, he said. It just makes you lonelier while you hurt. She looked at him, and he saw the recognition in her eyes, the acknowledgement that he might be right. What does heal it, then? I do not know yet, still working on that part. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Helpful. I do my best. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it grew worse as the night deepened, the wind shrieking around the cottage and the rain coming in horizontal sheets that rattled the shutters. Vance checked the lighthouse beam every hour, climbing the tower to ensure the mechanism still turned and the flame still burned. Each time he returned, Hessa was still there, reading one of his few books or simply sitting quietly by the fire. Around midnight, he put on more tea and brought out the journal she had returned 2 years ago. Have you read this? He asked. No, it seemed private. Thomas would not have minded. He was never precious about his writing. Vance opened the journal to a random page, recognizing his brother's loose scrawl. Most of it is navigation notes and weather observations, but there are personal entries too. He read silently for a moment, then found what he was looking for. Here, from 3 weeks before the wreck. Hessa saved my skin today when I nearly stepped on a coiled line during a heavy roll. She grabbed my shoulder and yanked me back without even looking up from the cleat she was securing. I asked her later how she knew, and she said she could hear my footsteps heading the wrong direction. Remarkable awareness. I am lucky to crew with her. Hessa's expression softened. I remember that. He was so focused on reaching the rail that he did not see the hazard. Vance turned more pages, reading aloud other entries where Thomas mentioned Hessa or the other crew members. The journal painted a picture of life aboard the ship, the camaraderie and conflicts, the long hours of routine punctuated by moments of excitement or danger. Thomas had been happy, Vance realized. His brother had found his place in the world, doing work he loved with people he respected. He did not die miserable, Vance said, more to himself than to Hessa. He died doing what he wanted where he wanted to be. Does that help? A little. It is better than thinking he died unhappy or afraid. He was not afraid, Hessa said quietly. I saw his face, just before the mast came down. He was trying to help someone else, trying to cut a fouled line to free the lifeboat. He died being exactly who he was. Vance closed the journal carefully and set it aside. Outside, the storm continued its rage, but inside the cottage something had shifted, some small easing of the weight they both carried. They talked through the night, trading memories of Thomas and the others who had died, and also stories of their lives before and after. Hessa described growing up in a mixed settlement on the southern coast, where orcs and humans lived in uneasy proximity, and the prejudice she had faced when she first went to sea. Most captains would not hire me, she said. Too much risk, they claimed. Orcs were not trustworthy, might turn violent, would frighten the passengers. Never mind that I had more training and experience than half the humans applying for the same positions. How did you find work then? Captain Morrill was different. Old sailor who judged people by their skills, not their skin. He hired me as deck crew on a cargo runner, and I worked my way up to navigator over 5 years. When he retired, he wrote me letters of recommendation that actually meant something. She smiled sadly. He was on the ship that wrecked. He died well too, went down trying to get the passengers to the boats. They were still talking when dawn began to gray the windows, the storm finally exhausting itself into a steady rain. Vance realized with some surprise that he had not spent this much time in conversation with another person since before Thomas died. It felt strange, like using muscles that had atrophied from disuse, but also good in a way he had almost forgotten. I should go, Hessa said, rising and stretching. The weather is clearing. I can make it back to port by evening if I leave now. But even as she spoke, Vance looked out the window and saw the clouds massing again on the horizon, darker and heavier than before. Another storm coming, he said, likely to hit by midday. Hessa followed his gaze and frowned. You are certain? I have watched this coast for 6 years. I know the patterns. That is a bad one building. She hesitated, and he could see the conflict in her face. She needed to leave, needed to reach Krellmark before the ship sailed without her. But she was also a sailor, and sailors learned to respect the weather or die. Stay another day, Vance said. One more day will not make you miss your ship, and it might save your life. You think it will be that bad? I think I would rather not watch the sea take anyone else I know. The words hung in the air between them, more honest than he had intended. Hessa looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. One more day, but I help with the work. I will not sit idle while you maintain the light. They fell into a routine over the course of that day. Vance taught Hessa the rhythms of lighthouse keeping, showing her how to trim the wicks and clean the lens, how to check the clockwork mechanism and refill the oil reservoir. She learned quickly, her sailor's instincts translating well to the work. They cooked together, Simple meals of fish and bread and root vegetables from Vance's small garden, and they continued to talk, the conversation flowing more easily now that some barrier had been crossed. The second storm hit in the early afternoon, even worse than the first. Waves crashed against the rocks below the lighthouse, sending spray high enough to miss the lamp chamber windows. The wind was a constant roar, and twice Vance had to go out to secure shutters that had torn loose from their fittings. Hessa worked beside him, her strength and sure-footedness making the work easier than it would have been alone. That night, as they sat by the fire again, Vance found himself telling her about the nightmares. "I dream about the wreck sometimes. In the dreams, I can reach Thomas. I am always just a hand's breadth away from grabbing him, from pulling him to safety. But I can never quite make it. The distance never closes." "I dream about the reef," Hessa said. "I see it coming in the dream, see the rocks beneath the water, and I open my mouth to shout a warning, but no sound comes out. I am silent while the ship drives itself to pieces. Do the dreams ever stop? Not yet, but they have gotten less frequent over the years." "How much less?" "I used to have them every night. Now it is perhaps once a week." Vance did a rough calculation. If the dreams had started 8 years ago and were now down to once a week, that was progress, but achingly slow progress. He would be an old man before he slept peacefully. "That is a bleak timeline," he said. "Yes, but it is better than never improving at all." They were quiet for a while, listening to the storm. Then Hessa said, "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you keep me here? You could have let me leave after the first storm. Instead, you warned me about the second." "Why?" Vance considered the question. He had asked himself the same thing, and the answer was not entirely clear even in his own mind. "You are the only person I have met who understands," he said finally. "Everyone else either pities me or thinks I should be over it by now. You know what it is like to carry this kind of loss. I suppose I did not want to let that go quite yet." "Is that the only reason?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the orc woman who had brought him his brother's belongings, but a person in her own right. Strong and scarred and still trying to find her way forward through grief. Someone he wanted to know better, if he was honest with himself. "No," he admitted. "It is not the only reason." She held his gaze, and something passed between them, some acknowledgement of a connection forming. Then she smiled just slightly and returned her attention to the fire. The second storm blew itself out over the next 2 days, but by then, a third system was moving in from the northwest, and Vance convinced Hessa to stay through that one as well. She sent a message to Krellmark via a passing fishing boat, declining the crew position with apologies and a promise to seek another berth in the future. If she had regrets about the decision, she did not voice them. Instead, she settled into the rhythm of lighthouse life. They divided the work between them, Vance handling the more technical aspects of maintaining the light, while Hessa took on repairs and improvements to the cottage and outbuildings. She proved to be skilled with tools, able to mend the loose shingles on the roof and replace rotted boards in the walkway with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. "I worked as a ship's carpenter for a year," she explained when Vance complimented her work. "Between navigator positions. It was good money, and I learned skills that have served me well." The autumn deepened into early winter. The storms came less frequently now, but the cold settled in, bringing frost and occasional snow. Vance found himself grateful for Hessa's presence in ways that had nothing to do with shared grief. The cottage was warmer with 2 people, both literally and figuratively. They cooked together, ate together, worked together, and in the evenings they read or talked or simply sat in comfortable silence. One night, perhaps 3 weeks after Hessa had first arrived, Vance brought out a packet of letters he had found in Thomas's sea chest. "I have been avoiding these," he said. "They are letters Thomas wrote but never sent. I found them after he died and could not bring myself to read them." "Why now?" Hessa asked. "Because I think I am finally ready, and because I would like you to be here when I do." They read the letters together, taking turns reading aloud. Most were addressed to Vance, full of stories and observations from Thomas's travels. Some were funny, some were poignant, and all of them revealed a person who had loved his brother deeply and missed him even while pursuing his own dreams. One letter, near the bottom of the stack, was addressed to both Vance and their mother, who had died when they were young. In it, Thomas wrote about finding a place where he belonged, about the family he had built among his crewmates, and about his hopes for the future. "I know Vance worries about me," Vance read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "He thinks the sea is too dangerous, that I am taking unnecessary risks. But he does not understand that I am safer here doing this work than I would be anywhere else. This is where I am meant to be. I only hope that someday he finds his own place, wherever that might be, and feels this same sense of rightness." Vance set the letter down carefully. "I thought I had found that place here at the lighthouse, but now I wonder if I was just hiding." "Maybe it was both," Hessa said gently. "Maybe you needed to hide for a while to heal enough to start looking for what comes next." "What comes next?" He looked at her. "I thought I knew. Tend the light, grow old, die quietly, simple and safe. And now I think maybe I want something more. Something that involves not being alone." Hessa reached out and took his hand, her grip warm and solid. "I think I want that too." They did not speak of love that night or make grand declarations. But something had been acknowledged, a door opened to possibilities neither had allowed themselves to consider. When they finally went to sleep, Hessa in the cottage sleeping alcove and Vance on a bedroll by the fire, both of them rested easier than they had in years. The winter settled in properly after that, bringing snow that blanketed the headland and turned the lighthouse into a stark white tower against gray skies. Vance and Hessa worked together to winterize the cottage, banking earth against the foundation and sealing gaps where the wind might penetrate. They stockpiled firewood and dried fish, laid in stores of flour and oil and other necessities that would see them through until spring. Hessa proved invaluable during a particularly fierce storm in late December, when ice formed on the lighthouse lamp and threatened to block the beam. Together they climbed the tower every few hours through the night, chipping away the ice and keeping the light burning. It was exhausting, dangerous work, but they moved in sync, each anticipating what the other needed without having to speak. Afterward, sitting by the fire and thawing their frozen hands, Vance said, "I could not have managed that alone. You would have found a way, you always do. Perhaps, but it would have been harder and lonelier, and I would not have had anyone to share the victory with when it was done." Hessa smiled. "Victory feels better with company." "Everything feels better with company. I had forgotten that." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat that way until the fire burned low and sleep finally claimed them both. The winter was long but not unbearable. They read through all of Vance's books, then started trading with passing ships for new ones. A merchant captain who stopped to confirm his position gave them a collection of poetry in exchange for fresh water and Hessa's help repairing a damaged mast fitting. A fishing boat dropped off a natural history text that its captain had found too dry for his taste, but thought the lighthouse keeper might enjoy. Vance and Hessa read to each other in the evenings, taking turns with voices and accents, sometimes laughing at their own terrible attempts to render dialogue dramatically. It was a small pleasure, but it filled the dark winter nights with warmth. They also talked about the future, carefully at first, then with growing confidence. Hessa admitted that she had been drifting for years, taking crew positions because it was what she knew how to do, but never putting down roots anywhere. "I was afraid," she said. "Afraid that if I stopped moving, the grief would catch up with me. As long as I kept sailing, kept seeing new places and meeting new people, I could stay ahead of it. Did that work? Not really. The grief traveled with me wherever I went. I just pretended it did not." Vance understood. His own approach had been different but equally avoidant. "I tried to bury mine in work. If I was busy enough, I would not have time to feel it. Did that work? Not really. It was always there, waiting for the moments between tasks." "We are both fools," Hessa said, echoing her words from that first night. "Yes, but maybe we can be fools together, and that will make us slightly less foolish. I am not sure that is how foolishness works. It is worth trying." One evening in late January, as a clear cold settled over the headland and the stars burned bright overhead, Vance took Hessa up to the lighthouse lamp chamber. They stood together in the slowly revolving light, watching the beam sweep across the dark water. "This is what I do," Vance said. "Every night, every storm, every season. I keep the light burning so that others do not suffer the same fate as Thomas and the rest. It is not glamorous work, and it will never make me wealthy or famous, but it matters." "I know it matters," Hessa said. "I have seen what happens when lights fail or are not where they should be." "I want you to stay," Vance said, the words coming out in a rush before he could second-guess them. "Not just for the winter, but permanently. I want you to make this place your home if you will have it." Hessa was quiet for a long moment, and Vance felt his heart hammering in his chest. He had taken a risk, spoken too soon perhaps, and now he would pay for it with rejection and awkwardness. But then she turned to him, her face illuminated by the sweeping beam, and he saw tears on her green cheeks. "I want that too," she said. "I have wanted it for weeks but was afraid to say it." "Why afraid?" "Because I thought you were just being kind, giving shelter to a wanderer out of obligation to your brother's memory. I did not dare hope that you might want me for my own sake." Vance reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I want you for every sake there is, for your strength and your skill and your company, for the way you understand my grief without trying to fix it, for the way you make this cottage feel like a home instead of just a place where I sleep between shifts." "That is quite a list," Hessa said, smiling through her tears. "I could go on. Please do not. I might start believing I am worthy of all that. You are worthy of all that and more." They kissed then, gently at first, then with more urgency as the weeks of unspoken feeling finally found expression. The lighthouse beam turned around them, sweeping its patient arc across the sea, and for the first time in years, Vance felt something other than grief and guilt. He felt hope. They made their partnership official in the spring, exchanging vows in a simple ceremony witnessed by the local magistrate and a handful of fishermen who had become familiar faces over the winter. There was no church, no elaborate feast, no crowd of well-wishers. Just two people promising to build a life together on the edge of the world, keeping the light burning and watching the sea. Some of the villagers grumbled about the match, muttering about orcs and propriety and the strangeness of it all. But most simply shrugged and went about their business. The lighthouse keeper and his wife were doing good work, keeping ships safe, and that was what mattered in the end. Hessa continued to take occasional crew positions during the calmer summer months, short runs along the coast that kept her skills sharp and brought in extra income. But she always came back to the lighthouse, and Vance always watched for her sail on the horizon with an eagerness that surprised him with its intensity. "I missed you," he would say when she climbed the path to the cottage, salt-stained and smiling. "I was gone 4 days," she would reply. 4 days too long. She would laugh and kiss him and tell him he was absurd, but he could see in her eyes that she had missed him too. They established new routines together. In addition to maintaining the light, they began keeping detailed records of weather patterns and ship movements, data that they shared with the maritime office, and that proved useful for improving navigation charts. Hessa's knowledge of currents and wind patterns complemented Vance's understanding of the local coast, and together they produced work that was more comprehensive than either could have managed alone. They also began the slow work of rebuilding their connections to the wider world. Vance had cut himself off from most of his old friends after Thomas died, unable to face their sympathy or their attempts to help him move on. Now, with Hessa's encouragement, he started accepting invitations to village gatherings, attending the occasional festival or market day. It was not always easy. There were still people who looked at Hessa with suspicion or distaste, who made comments about orcs and humans that were meant to wound. But there were also people who welcomed her, who appreciated her skills and respected the work she and Vance did together. "It will get better," Hessa said after one particularly awkward encounter with a merchant who had refused to sell to her directly. "People fear what they do not understand. The more they see us living ordinary lives, the less frightening we become." "You should not have to prove your humanity to anyone," Vance said angrily. "No, I should not. But that is the world we live in. I can rage against it, or I can try to change it one interaction at a time. I will rage against it for both of us." She smiled and squeezed his hand. "I appreciate that, but do not let it consume you. We have better things to spend our energy on." One of those better things was the memorial cairn. The idea came to them during a conversation about Thomas and the others who had died in the wreck. They had been talking about memory, about how to honor the dead without letting grief define the living, and Hessa had mentioned a tradition from her childhood. "In my village, when someone died at sea, we would build a cairn on the highest point overlooking the water. Just a simple pile of stones, but each stone represented a memory, a story, something we wanted to carry forward about the person we lost." "That sounds like a good tradition," Vance said. "Would you want to build one?" For Thomas and the others, he thought about it for a long moment. The idea of a physical memorial felt different from the internal shrine he had been maintaining all these years. It would be a way of acknowledging the loss publicly, of saying that these people mattered and would not be forgotten. But it would also be a way of containing the grief, giving it a specific place instead of letting it permeate every aspect of his life. "Yes," he said, "I would like that very much." They chose a spot on the headland, a rocky outcrop that looked directly south toward the Sorrow Reef where the ship had broken apart. Over the course of several weeks, they gathered stones from the beach and the hills, carrying them up to the cairn site and placing them with care. Each stone was accompanied by a story. Vance talked about Thomas, about their childhood together, and the man his brother had become. Hessa spoke of Captain Morrill and the other crew members, describing their quirks and talents and the holes they had left in the world when they died. Sometimes they cried while they worked, and sometimes they laughed, remembering moments of joy and absurdity that grief had overshadowed but not erased. The cairn grew slowly, stone by stone, memory by memory. It was not a grand monument, just a rough pyramid of rocks about as tall as a man's chest, but it felt right. Solid and enduring like the people it represented, on a clear day in early autumn, nearly a year after Hessa had first returned the compass, they placed the final stones. Vance stepped back and looked at the cairn, feeling something shift inside him. The grief was still there, would always be there in some form, but it no longer felt like a weight crushing him down. It had been transformed into something else, something closer to acceptance. "They would have liked this," he said. I think so too, Hessa agreed. They stood together for a while looking out at the sea. The water was calm today, blue-green and glittering in the sunlight, giving no hint of the violence it could unleash. A merchant ship was visible on the horizon, its sails full and white, following the safe passage marked by Vance's lighthouse. "I have been thinking," Vance said eventually, "about what Thomas wrote in that letter, about finding a place where I belong. And I think I have found it. Not just the lighthouse, but this. You and me, the work we do, the life we are building. This is my place." Hessa leaned against him and he put his arm around her, holding her close. "Mine too," she said quietly. "I did not think I would find it after so many years of searching, but here it is." They returned to the cottage as the sun began to set, walking the familiar path together. That night, they lit the lighthouse beam as they did every night, watching it sweep across the water in its steady rhythm. Ships would see that light and know where they were, would adjust their course to avoid the rocks, would make it safely to harbor because two people on a remote headland had chosen to keep a promise. It was not the life Vance had imagined for himself when he was young, nor was it what Hessa had expected when she first went to sea. But it was a good life, full of purpose and companionship and small moments of grace. And perhaps, in the end, that was enough. The seasons turned, and the rhythm of their days continued. Winter storms and summer calms, ships saved and occasional rescues when, despite all precautions, a vessel still found the rocks. They expanded their garden, adding a small greenhouse that allowed them to grow vegetables even in the coldest months. Hessa built shelves for Vance's growing collection of books and navigation charts. Vance repaired the roof of the lighthouse tower, replacing old timbers that had begun to rot. They talked sometimes about traveling, about seeing more of the world beyond the headland. But they never quite managed to leave for long. There was always something that needed doing, some reason to return, and eventually they stopped making plans and simply accepted that this was where they belonged. On the first anniversary of the day Hessa had returned the compass, Vance gave her a gift. It was a small wooden box, beautifully made from pieces of driftwood he had collected and joined together with perfect seams. Inside, cushioned on a bed of wool, was the compass itself. "I want you to have it," he said. "Thomas would have wanted you to have it. You were his friend, and you are my wife, and you have earned it 100 times over." Hessa held the compass gently, watching the needle swing to north. "Are you certain?" "I am certain. You brought it back to me so I could let him go. Now I am giving it to you so we can both move forward. Together." She closed the box carefully and set it on the shelf next to the watch and the journal, all three objects arranged in a small shrine to memory and survival. Then she turned to Vance and pulled him close, and they stood together in the cottage that had become their home, listening to the wind and the waves and the sound of each other breathing. Years passed. They grew older, gray beginning to thread through both their hair, lines appearing on their faces that spoke of laughter and worry and long days in the sun and wind. The lighthouse required constant maintenance, and they were always finding new repairs to make, new systems to improve. But the work was satisfying, and they did it together, and that made all the difference. Occasionally, other orcs would stop at the lighthouse, drawn by the knowledge that one of their own had found acceptance here. Hessa always welcomed them, offering food and shelter and sometimes advice about navigating the complicated waters of human prejudice. Some stayed for a few days, others for weeks, and a few decided to settle in the area permanently, finding work on fishing boats or in the village. Gradually, the region developed a reputation as a place where orcs and humans could coexist peacefully. It was not perfect, and there were still incidents of bigotry and violence, but things were improving. Vance and Hessa's relationship had become proof that such partnerships were possible, and other mixed couples began to emerge, tentatively building their own lives. "We are making a difference," Hessa said one evening, watching a young orc woman and her human husband walk past the lighthouse on their way to the village. "Not just with the light, but with how we live." "Thomas would have liked that," Vance said. "He always believed people could be better than their worst impulses if given the chance." He was right about that, about a lot of things. They visited the cairn regularly, sometimes together and sometimes alone. It had become a place for reflection, a spot where they could sit and think about the past without being overwhelmed by it. Vance often brought small objects to leave among the stones, tokens that reminded him of his brother. Hessa did the same for her lost crewmates. Over time, the cairn became decorated with these offerings, a collection of memories rendered in wood and shell and sea glass. Other people began leaving offerings too. Shipwreck survivors who had been saved by the lighthouse, sailors who had known someone who died at sea, villagers who simply wanted to honor those lost to the water. The cairn became a communal monument, a place where grief could be acknowledged and then released. On a spring morning, 5 years after the cairn's completion, Vance woke to find Hessa standing at the cottage window, looking out at the sea with an expression he could not quite read. "What is wrong?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Nothing is wrong," she said slowly. "I was just thinking about that first night when I brought you the compass. I thought it would be my last visit. I was so sure that I needed to keep moving that staying in one place would destroy me. And now I cannot imagine being anywhere else. This is home. You are home." She turned to him and he saw tears in her eyes, but they were not sad tears. "I am happy, Vance. For the first time since the wreck, I am genuinely, completely happy, and I wanted you to know that." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I am happy too. Happier than I ever thought I would be after losing Thomas. You gave me that. We gave it to each other." They stood together as the sun rose higher, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The lighthouse beam had been extinguished for the day, its work done until nightfall. Seabirds wheeled overhead, crying their harsh songs, and somewhere in the distance, a ship's bell rang out as a vessel made port. It was an ordinary morning, like thousands of others they had shared and thousands more they would share in the years to come. But it was also perfect in its ordinariness, a moment of peace hard-won through grief and work and love. Vance thought about the compass, about the journey it had taken from Thomas's hands to his own to Hessa's. It had been a tool for finding direction, for navigating through uncertainty toward solid ground. In a way, that was what they had all been doing, Thomas and Hessa and himself, searching for the place where they belonged. Thomas had found his place at sea, doing work he loved with people he respected. He had died too young, but he had died living fully, and there was some comfort in that. Hessa had wandered for years, carrying her guilt like ballast, until she found her way to this lighthouse and the man who understood her grief. And Vance himself had hidden for years in isolation and work, until Hessa showed him that healing was possible, that life could be more than just survival. "Do you ever regret it?" Hessa asked suddenly. "Asking me to stay? You had a quiet life here before I arrived." "Never," Vance said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Even better than keeping the lighthouse. The lighthouse is just a job. You are my life." She laughed and kissed him, and he tasted salt from the sea air on her lips. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was fully above the horizon, and the day was waiting for them to begin their work. But first, they stood together on the headland and looked at the cairn, at the monument they had built to memory and loss, and the people who had shaped them. The stones stood solid against the wind, enduring, just as love endures beyond death and grief transforms into something bearable over time. "Thank you," Vance said quietly, speaking to his brother's memory. "Thank you for having friends who cared enough to check on me after you were gone. Thank you for being the kind of man who inspired that loyalty." Hessa added her own silent words, her lips moving in a prayer or farewell that was hers alone. Then they turned away from the cairn and walked back to the cottage, ready to face whatever the day would bring. The lighthouse stood tall behind them, its white tower bright against the blue sky. That night, they would light the lamp again, and it would sweep its beam across the dark water, warning ships away from danger, guiding them toward safety. Night after night, year after year, the light would burn, kept alive by two people who had found each other through shared grief and built something beautiful from the ruins of loss. It was not a fairy tale ending, with everything perfect and all wounds healed. The scars remained, the nightmares still came sometimes, and the prejudice against orcs had not vanished overnight. But it was real, and it was good, and it was theirs. And in the end, that was everything.